What would have beaten you faster? When British historian B.H. Liddell Hart asked that question to captured German commanders in 1946, he expected a technical answer, something about logistics, air power, industrial capacity. He didn't expect an indictment. Field Marshal Gerrit von Rundstedt, the senior German commander in the West, looked at him and described a strategic gift the Allies had given Germany in September 1944, a gift that cost tens of thousands of American lives and extended the war by 6 months. Liddell Hart realized he wasn't hearing a critique of a map. He was hearing that the silence of the guns could have started 6 months earlier. Every grave dug between September and May suddenly felt like a choice. The Germans knew they were defeated that autumn. Their army was broken. The road to Berlin was open. They were waiting for the finishing blow. But because of a political compromise in Allied high command, that blow never came. Late August 1944, the German army in France wasn't retreating. It was disintegrating. The Falaise pocket had been a catastrophe. Tens of thousands of soldiers captured, tens of thousands more killed. Equipment losses were absolute. Tanks, artillery, transport vehicles littered the roads for miles. Field Marshal Walter Model arrived to take command of the Western Front. Hitler's troubleshooters sent to fix every disaster. What Model found made his stomach turn. He had fragments of units, soldiers without weapons, officers without men. The defensive line existed on paper only. Model's entire force had roughly 100 operational tanks. The rest were broken down or out of fuel. The Allies had 12 armored divisions ready to attack. The ROR, Germany's industrial heartland, the forge that built their weapons, lay virtually undefended. Model had nothing to stop a concentrated thrust. For 3 weeks in September 1944, Germany was defenseless. Allied intelligence knew it. Patton's Third Army knew it. The soldiers racing across France could feel it. German resistance was collapsing faster than they could advance. The GIs in Third Army weren't just moving, they were flying. For the first time since D-Day, they could smell the end. Some believed they'd be home by Thanksgiving. They didn't know the brakes were already being pulled from a desk hundreds of miles away. Patton reached the Moselle River, the last major water barrier before the Sigrid Line. His tanks were 100 miles from the German border. The path to the Rhine was open. The path beyond was open. His intelligence officer, Oskar Koch, delivered assessment after assessment. The Germans were finished. Their army was broken. One concentrated push would end it. Model was desperately scraping together whatever he could find. Old men from reserve units, teenagers from Hitler Youth, rear echelon clerks who had never fired a rifle in combat. He was building a defensive line out of desperation and prayer. Every day the Allies delayed, Model got stronger. Every week gave him more time to rebuild. The window was closing. September 1st, 1944. Dwight Eisenhower assumed direct command of Allied ground forces. He faced a decision that would determine how the war ended. Concentrate everything on one axis and punch through to the Ruhr, or advance on multiple fronts simultaneously and squeeze Germany from all directions. The concentrated thrust was the aggressive option. Pick your best commander, give him everything, let him run. High risk, high reward. If it worked, the war ends in weeks. If it failed, you've bet everything on one card. Patton wanted it. American doctrine supported it. German defenses couldn't stop it. But Eisenhower wasn't just a general. He was managing an alliance. Montgomery wanted priority in the north. Churchill was pressuring Roosevelt to give British forces a larger role. Montgomery threatened to go over Eisenhower's head to Churchill if he didn't receive priority. The resulting political crisis could have fractured the alliance, and Patton was politically toxic. The slapping incidents had made him impossible to promote publicly. Giving him supreme operational authority would have caused an uproar in Washington. There was also a logistical problem. The Allies had captured Antwerp on September 4th, one of Europe's largest ports, but German forces still controlled the Scheldt estuary leading to it. Until the estuary was cleared, the port was useless. Clearing the Scheldt was Montgomery's responsibility, but he was focused on Market Garden instead. The broad front meant advancing slowly without a frontline supply port. Eisenhower chose the broad front, not because he didn't understand the map, because he understood the politics. It was the tax paid to keep the coalition together. Patton's Third Army ground to a halt in the first week of September, not because of German resistance, because of empty fuel tanks. The Allied supply system was breaking down. Trucks from the Red Ball Express couldn't move fuel fast enough from the Normandy beaches. Every army was running short. And when Eisenhower had to choose who got priority, he chose Montgomery. Montgomery had convinced Eisenhower to support Operation Market Garden, an audacious airborne assault to capture bridges across the Rhine in Holland. He promised it would end by Christmas. Eisenhower gave him priority for fuel, ammunition, and transport aircraft. American airborne divisions were placed under British command. The entire Allied Air Force was dedicated to supporting the operation. Patton was furious. His army sat motionless while the path to Germany remained open. He told his staff that they were handing the Germans exactly what they needed: time. Market Garden launched on September 17, 1944. It was the largest airborne operation in history, and it failed catastrophically. The 1st British Airborne Division was surrounded at Arnhem. German forces they weren't supposed to encounter cut them to pieces. Of 10,000 men who landed, barely 2,000 escaped. The rest were killed or captured. Total Allied casualties exceeded 17,000. The war would not end by Christmas. As the remnants of the 1st Airborne waded back across the Rhine, the tragedy wasn't just the men lost in the woods of Arnhem, it was the fuel that wasn't in Patton's tanks. The momentum that had been gambled on a shortcut that led to a dead end. Walter Model couldn't believe his luck. In the first week of September, he had nothing: a broken army, no reserves, no defensive line. He had reported to Hitler that the situation was hopeless without immediate reinforcement. Then the Allied advance slowed, stopped in some sectors. The concentrated thrust he feared never came. Model worked frantically. He pulled units from quiet sectors. He activated every reserve formation in Germany. He conscripted factory workers and gave them rifles. Day by day, the West Wall, what the Allies called the Siegfried Line, came back to life. By late September, he had a defensive line. By October, he had reserves. By November, he was planning a counteroffensive. The Allies had given him 6 weeks. 6 weeks to rebuild an army from wreckage. 6 weeks that should never have existed. Model knew exactly why he was still fighting. The enemy had spread their forces across a broad front instead of concentrating for a killing blow. It was a strategic gift. The war ground on through the winter. Germany surrendered in May 1945. And then the interrogations began. The individual testimonies Liddell Hart collected were damning, but the collective consensus was devastating. When he cross-referenced his interviews, a single sentence emerged, one that Allied politicians wished he had never written. All the German generals to whom I talked were of the opinion that the Allied Supreme Command had missed a great opportunity of ending the war in the autumn of 1944. Rundstedt was direct. He told Liddell Hart exactly what the Allies should have done. The best course would have been to concentrate a really strong striking force with which to break through past Aachen to the Ruhr area. Strategically and politically, Berlin was the target. Germany's strength is in the north. He who holds northern Germany holds Germany. Rundstedt paused, then delivered his conclusion. Such a breakthrough, coupled with air domination, would have torn in pieces the weak German front and forced Germany's collapse. This wasn't an excuse for losing. This was professional military analysis from the man who had commanded Germany's defense. He was explaining exactly how the Allies could have destroyed him faster, and he was explaining why they hadn't. Rundstedt wasn't alone. Blumentritt called it a gift. Von Manteuffel called the broad front strategy fundamentally wrong. Kurt Meyer, the SS Panzer commander, was the most blunt. The backbone of German resistance was broken. They were just waiting for the Allies to notice. General after general, the same verdict. The Reich was given a second lease on life because the killing blow never came. Liddell Hart asked the obvious follow-up question. If a concentrated thrust was the answer, who should have led it? The Germans weren't advocating for Montgomery despite his arguments for a northern thrust. They had found Montgomery predictable, methodical. You always knew what he would do next. Bradley was competent but cautious. German commanders could anticipate his movements and prepare defenses accordingly. But when asked about Patton, the assessment changed. Rundstedt reportedly told the Stars and Stripes reporter after his capture that Patton was their best. The American way of war, speed, aggression, armored thrusts, relentless pressure, that was the formula that terrified German commanders. That was what they said would have destroyed them. And that was exactly what coalition politics had suppressed. Patton had been right all along. The enemy confirmed it. Once the September window closed, the Allies faced months of fighting that German generals said was unnecessary. Hurtgen Forest. American forces spent 3 months fighting through dense woodland for terrain that could have been bypassed. 33,000 casualties, one of the bloodiest battles of the European theater. While generals at Schaeff debated coalition harmony, 19-year-olds in the Hurtgen were rotting in frozen foxholes, fighting for every yard of a forest that didn't need to be taken against an enemy that should have already surrendered. The Siegfried Line, taken by bloody frontal assault because it hadn't been outflanked when it was weak. The battles ground on through autumn and into winter. American soldiers died taking ground that should have been behind them months earlier. Every casualty had a name. Every death produced a telegram to a family back home. German generals interviewed in comfortable captivity explained that it didn't have to happen this way. December 16, 1944, Germany launched its last major offensive through the Ardennes. The attack succeeded initially because Eisenhower's broad front had left defensive positions thin. There were no reserves where they were needed. The Germans achieved complete surprise. 80,000 American casualties in 6 weeks, 19,000 dead. The 106th Infantry Division surrendered 7,000 men, the largest mass surrender of American forces in the European theater. This was the offensive that Model had spent the autumn preparing. This was what the 6 weeks of September and October had bought Germany. Time to rebuild, time to plan, time to launch one final desperate attack. German generals didn't claim the Bulge would have succeeded regardless. They acknowledged it was only possible because the Allied broad front gave them time to prepare. A concentrated Allied thrust in September would have forced German surrender before any counteroffensive was possible. Every handshake that kept a general happy meant the front line moved a little slower. The casualty lists grew a little longer. The Germans understood coalition politics better than the Allies realized. One captured officer told interrogators that the Allies were fighting 2 wars, one against Germany and one against each other. Germany only had to survive the second war long enough to rebuild for the first. Every time Montgomery and Patton competed for resources, Germany won time. Every time Eisenhower compromised to keep the alliance happy, German defensive lines grew stronger. Rundstedt recognized this. He had studied the Allied command structure. He knew that Eisenhower's job was as much political as military. He knew that concentration of force was politically impossible, even when it was militarily obvious. The broad front wasn't a military strategy. It was a political necessity. And German generals understood that distinction perfectly. Historians still debate whether a concentrated thrust could have ended the war in 1944. Supply lines were stretched, ports were damaged, a single thrust might have outrun its logistics and been destroyed in isolation. But these arguments came from Allied planners who had reasons to justify their decisions. The German commanders who actually faced those decisions had a different view. Rundstedt had nothing in September. The Ruhr was open. The Siegfried Line was unmanned. A concentrated attack with everything available would have broken through before Germany could recover. The men who would have had to stop that attack said it couldn't be stopped. The enemies trying to destroy America understood Allied leadership better than Washington did. German generals saw what politicians refused to admit. Military speed mattered more than coalition harmony. Concentrated aggression beats dispersed caution. The commander who could win fastest wasn't the commander who got the resources. Eisenhower kept the alliance together. That was his job, and he did it well. But keeping the alliance together wasn't the same as ending the war as fast as possible. History remembers Eisenhower as the man who won the war. German generals remembered him as the man who let them survive the autumn. There is a distinction between a commander who wins a war and a commander who ends one as fast as possible. You can find that distinction in the dates on the headstones. Von Rundstedt, Blumentritt, von Manteuffel, they all said the same thing. The war could have ended in 1944. It didn't because political considerations overrode military logic. They told us what would have beaten them. They told us who should have led. They delivered their professional judgment without hesitation. The question history asks is simple. Was anyone listening?